All right, so now we're on the end of World War I. So again, back in your Google Classroom, you're going to click on above the Armenian genocide. Hopefully you can see this. The end of World War I. The best part of the end of World War I is that you don't actually have to do any work. You just have to read it, or in this case, listen to me, whatever floats your boat. So let's look at the learning targets. Heading over here. So the end of World War I is right over here under these birds. So the learning targets are, I can describe why the U.S. entered and why Russia left World War I. I can identify the technology of World War I. I told you that was going to come up again. There it is. I can identify various elements of propaganda. And then the real work are all these names and people and vocabulary words. Stalemate, trench warfare, Woodrow Wilson, the Lusitania, the Zimmerman Note, Doughboys, propaganda, freedom of the seas, Nicholas II and Alexandra, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and armistice. So let's go back to the Google Slides. So you have your Google Slides up. It should look like this. I wonder if that makes it better. We'll try it. All right. So because of trench warfare, the majority of World War I was a stalemate. A stalemate is when you can't make headway in any battle. It's if you play tic-tac-toe and nobody can make any more moves. We call it cats. Or in chess, when all legal moves are played out. And I included a video on stalemate right here. Now, because of the stalemate, Western European countries tried to introduce all kinds of technology to beat the trench. Some of the technology you're going to see in this video looks pretty barbaric, kind of medieval, and some of it is going to be pretty fancy schmancy, including poison gas. We learned a lot about poison gas with that Fritz Haber assignment. The tank and the airplane. If you watch that Snoopy Christmas video I posted, the airplane and machine guns played a role there. One of the things that historians sometimes say about World War I is that they rode into World War I on horses and they rode out on tanks. We're going to go from old-fashioned to pretty newfangled warfare in about 4 years. Another characteristic of World War I is that it's industrial. It's the first industrial war. All the resources of the countries that were involved were invested in fighting the war. All right, turning point for allies is when the U.S. entered the war. Throughout the majority of World War I, the U.S. was neutral. But despite saying out loud, hey, we're neutral, don't be mad at us, the U.S. was definitely leaning towards aiding the Allies. The Allies include England, France, Russia, and Italy. This was because of our history, mostly with England. We had the same values, democracy, freedom of speech, all that jazz, and we had 100 and some odd years of friendship. The Central Powers, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria, all knew that we were kind of like England's pal. Woodrow Wilson, who was the U.S. president at the time, was running for re-election in 1916, kind of in the heat of the battle for Europeans in World War I. And he won on the theme, he kept us out of war. That was his slogan, kind of like Make America Great Again, or Yes We Can. His was, he kept us out of war. U.S. neutrality was shaken pretty early on in the war. About a year in, a British passenger ship called Lusitania was sunk. Lusitania was the sister ship to the Titanic. It was built in the same shipyard, the same year, the same designers as the Titanic was. The very similar ships. And we know what happened to the Titanic. This was a British passenger ship that was leaving New York Harbor in May of 1915. It was going back home to England. The Germans put an ad in the newspapers in New York and said, hey, you guys, we are at war with Britain, FYI. And if we see any British ships out in the sea, we're going to blow them up. We're probably going to do this with U-boats, our brand new technology. And it's going to kind of be surprising, but not too surprising. Oops, sorry. Not too surprising because we are telling you this in this advertisement. Do not get on the ship because we will totally blow this ship up. So even though there was this warning, a bunch of passengers, most of them civilians, women and children and very, very wealthy people, regular Joe Schmoes, got on the boat and off they went. As they were making their way towards England, right outside of Ireland, the ship was torpedoed and it sank like a rock. It sank in 18 minutes. Now, if you've seen the movie Titanic, that's the one with Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet. In the movie Titanic, one of the things that I like about it as a history teacher is that once the Titanic hits the iceberg in the movie continues in real time. So the minute it hit to the minute it sunk in the movie is the exact same number of minutes it took for the ship to sink. Now, if you've seen the movie, it's kind of a long time. It took like over 2 hours, almost 3 hours for the ship to sink. The Lusitania sank, as you know, in 18 minutes. So why would the Lusitania sink so quickly? Wah, wah. What was the difference? The neutral United States, who said they had no country they were dealing with, giving any preferential treatment to, was actually sneaking artillery and explosives into Britain, just like Germany thought they would do. This is against the laws of neutrality. The ship sank. About 1,200 people died, and 128 of them were Americans. President Wilson called up Germany and said, hey, you guys, you cannot be sinking just regular ships out there. He told them, this is what the word they used, unrestricted submarine warfare. Eeks. You can't sink ships that aren't at battle with you. So Germany said, okay, you're right, we'll stop sinking ships. But this became kind of this rallying cry for the British and for Americans who are like, we got to get back at Germany for sinking our ship. There's a video here that you're going to watch. It's a little cartoon that was made in 1915 about the sinking of Lusitania. It's not like a Pixar cartoon. It isn't highfalutin like those movies are, but it'll get the point across. It's kind of long. It's about 8 minutes long. You just need to watch the first couple of minutes to find some propaganda. Germany stuck with this idea of freedom of the seas until about 1916. In 1916, the British put a blockade around Germany and wouldn't allow them to import or export any goods. The Germans found this to be unsustainable. They had to get food, they had to get munitions, they had to get, supplies. So they started to blow up ships again, even ships that were considered non-military. The second thing that kind of got the U.S.'s knickers in a knot is the Zimmerman note. Sometimes it's called the Zimmerman dispatch or the Zimmerman telegram. Now, a telegram at the time was kind of how we would send a text message. It's a message that was sent over a wire and it'd be like, you'd say like, do, little dots and dashes like SOS would come across a wire and people would listen in. So in January 1917, the U.S. found something called the Zimmerman note. This was a note from Germany to Mexico. In it, it said, if you help us defeat the U.S. in World War I, neither Mexico or the U.S. was actually involved in World War I at the time, we will give you back all the land that you lost to the U.S. in the Mexican-American War. The British really, really, really needed the Americans to help fight in this war. And they happened to find this German telegram. The Germans, you can see right here, just sent it through regular Western Union. This is how telegrams are even sent today, if you actually get a telegram. Western Union. So it just went through the regular Western Union office. The British found it and like, what is this? They made a copy of it, sent it to the U.S. and said, you see what Germany has said? They're going to get Mexico to fight against you. That's when America decided enough is enough. They declared war against the Central Powers. The American soldiers showed up in Europe in April of 1917, and they were nicknamed the Doughboys. And they were called the Doughboys because they were kind of chunky and plucky and all excited to be fighting in the war, kind of like the Pillsbury Doughboy would be. compared to the Europeans. Most Europeans had been fighting in the trenches for years and were skinny and sick and not doing so red hot. So the Americans were kind of this burst of energy that they needed. Here's a really short video. It's about 3 minutes long about the U.S. getting involved in World War I. I want you guys to watch that. One of the bummers is as U.S. was kind of getting ready to join the war, Russia was dropping out of the war. Russia fought with the Allies, England, France, and Italy, throughout World War I, and, spoiler alert, in World War II. Russia was a gigantic country, but it was very backwards. They didn't have much technology, but they had lots and lots of people. So every time they went to war, they would just back it up, like, oh, we lost 10,000 troops, send 20 more thousand troops to the front. But these soldiers had no supplies. They didn't have guns, they didn't have food, they didn't have uniforms, they didn't have boots, they didn't have winter hats, no supplies. Also, civilians who had nothing to do with the war also had no supplies. This has been the case in Russia for years and years and years. There's a story about these 2 German soldiers who were walking through the Russian wilderness. They didn't really know where they were. They were kind of separated from the rest of their troops. And they're like, oh gosh, it's kind of scary here in Russia. And then out of the woods, they hear all this, and all these Russian soldiers, thousands of Russian soldiers come out of the woods, and they had their hands up like, we surrender to these 2 German soldiers. Russian soldiers were deserting hand over fist to get out of the Russian army. They knew if they were in a prisoner of war camp, they had to get medicine, they had to get food, they had to be given chocolate, they had to be given cigarettes. That was the rule back then. So they were all giving up to the Russians, or to the Germans, just to have their basic needs met. So anyway, the war was going really badly for them. They kept losing battle after battle. The soldiers were defecting. Some of them were deserting. Some of them just kind of ran away. Nicholas II, who was the Tsar, said, I know what we need to do. We're not winning because our troops aren't inspired. And you know who's inspiring? I am. So the Tsar, that's the king, left his wife Alexandra in charge of Russia, and he went to the front to lead the troops because he was going to do a good job, except for he didn't know anything about leading troops, and they kept losing the war. But now, instead of it being the soldiers' fault, it was the Tsar's fault. Because he was leaving the capital, he left his wife in charge. His wife, Alexandra, was a German princess. Her uncle was the Kaiser of Germany. So, yeah, the Tsar of Russia married his niece. His niece was also the niece of the Russian Tsar, of the German king, who they were fighting in the war. And now she's in charge of Russia. Oh, it's so complicated. You think your Christmas stinks. Their Christmas must have really stunk. Another problem is that her son, his name is Alexei, is really, really sick with a disease called hemophilia. Hemophilia is a disorder of the blood that it doesn't clot. So even if you're wearing like shoes that are a little too tight, you could bleed to death because your blood won't clot. Instead of just getting a blister, you like blow up and die. She found this, we're going to talk more about this guy over here. He's called the Mad Monk, Rasputin. If you have Just Dance 2, or Just Dance, I forget what year it is. Anyway, Rasputin is a little dance thing on there. That's who it's about. She relies on him for advice on how to keep her son alive. And he is a dirty, gross, alcoholic, drug-drinking, eating, womanizing weirdo. And the people of Russia are like, this guy's got to be out of power. Anyway, with the Tsar at the front and the German princess in charge of Russia, it is a big surprise that Russia keeps losing battles. They don't have enough food, they don't have enough medicine, they don't have any supplies. So in March of 1917, the Russians revolt and kick the Tsar out of power. They put a guy in charge named Alexander Kerensky. Alexander Kerensky says, oh, we've made a deal with our other allies, with England and France. We can't let them down. So they stay in World War I. But even with the Tsar out of power, they don't have materials. So they keep losing the battles. So there's a second revolt. Oh, why is that there? There's a second revolt in November of 1917. If I can get this thing to go away. You see that? Ah! Nuts. Hang on. Here we go. Second revolt in 1917. This is a communist revolution or a Bolshevik revolution. And Russia drops out of the war. they'd sign a document with the Germans called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This is what got Russia out of World War I. Russia gave up a bunch of land, they lost a lot of power, but they were definitely out of the war. So I want you to watch this video. What this meant for the war itself is that before this, I'm going to show you something. Let's see if I can do it on here. So here's Europe. I'm going to draw a really accurate map of Europe. Here's the Central Powers. Here's where Germany is. Before this, Germany's fighting on the Western Front against France and on the Eastern Front against Russia. Now that Russia has dropped out of the war, Germany can focus all their troops over here on France and focus on defeating France. The Allies were really nervous. This is not going to go well. But, dun da da da, the doughboys are coming. Here comes America. So the war starts to turn to the benefit of the Allies. Once the American soldiers arrive, the exhausted European forces are relieved. The Americans are only in the war for about 19 months before the whole thing is over. More American soldiers died from the flu on the way to the war than actually died in the war. The war was seen as an adventure, and it was fun, and oh God, I can get away from my mom, or I can get away from my stupid girlfriend who's being a jerk. I can meet pretty ladies. I can make some money. I could do something with my friends. They get to sign up with your buddy and go to war. I've put down here 4 songs that were kind of like the hits of the day, all reflecting how Americans felt about going to the war. This one at the bottom is one of my favorites. My mom used to sing this song to me. But you can listen to any one of these. You don't have to listen to them all. Listen to one of the following songs. This one right here, Over There, is probably the most famous one. I put It's a Long Road to Tipperary on for Mrs. Carnes, because this is a traditionally Irish song. So with the U.S. in the war, the Central Powers started to feel the foot on their neck. They started to drop out of the war. Bulgaria dropped out in September of 1918, followed by the Ottoman Empire in October. Really right on their heels was Austria-Hungary in early November. The king of Germany abdicates. That means he quits being the king and then he runs away. They don't really know where he went. They think he was in Denmark somewhere hiding out. A new government takes over in Germany called the Weimar Republic. On November 9th, they take over. And on November 11th, they sign an armistice. They sign an agreement to stop fighting. It is important to know. An armistice doesn't say, oh, we lost. It's our fault. Sorry. An armistice is just an agreement to stop fighting. No one actually surrendered. They just say, we're going to put our guns down for a hot minute. Officially, the U.S. and Korea are still in an armistice from the Korean War from 1954. So this is not unheard of. One of the things that you need to remember, when Germany signed this in November of 1918, they still occupied French territory. They hadn't actually lost the war yet. They were going to lose. It was just a matter of a couple of, minutes or a couple of footsteps out of French territory, but they still occupied French territory. All right. So that's that for that assignment. You don't have anything to turn in. It's just me reading through the slides.